Finished. Good evening, everybody. My name is Dan Fingus, and I'm the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy and the Rights to Democracy Institute. And I'm so excited that you're here to join us for this evening to talk about green justice zones. And we start every meeting at Rights and Democracy with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to start this meeting in the same way. Rights and Democracy acknowledges the Mohican in southern Vermont and Abenaki peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Indakina, which includes parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, New England, and Quebec. As guests on unceded territory of the Mohican and Abenaki peoples, we honor their ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge that our nation has benefited from uncompensated and exploited labor represented in the legacy of slavery and the present day reality of migrant farm workers. Thank you all. We're here tonight to learn about green justice zones and envision what positive changes we could make to our communities if we have direct democracy and true community decision-making in response to the greatest environmental and infrastructure issues our communities face. This evening, we will hear from regional leaders who are experts in the policy and process of green justice zones and have successfully started these zones in their local community. We will also have time for all of us to envision what green justice zones would look like in communities across Vermont. Before we get started, we want to do a short introduction of the two organizations who are hosting this event. Rights and Democracy, which we call RAD for short, was founded in 2015 on the theory of change that it takes people power year after year to make the kind of big, bold, long-term changes we want to see in this country. Part of that theory of change is that it takes grassroots and political infrastructure, in this case, a membership organization, to sustain the momentum necessary to do that work. RAD membership and staff work on issues that matter to our communities, organize for policy change at the local, state, and national level, and center those most affected in our campaigns and create the solutions that their communities need. Our members are from all walks of life, intergenerational, multicultural, activists, artists, organizers, but most importantly, passionate fighters for true social justice and meaningful change in our communities across the state. In the past 2 years, RAD has joined with organizations across New England to form Renew New England and in Vermont, Vermont Renews. These state and regional coalitions are working towards intersectional solutions to the climate crisis that not only meets the crisis itself, but also does so in a just and equitable way. I now want to introduce Tasha Wallace, Executive Director of the Lamoille County Planning Commission, to share more about the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies and the work that they do. Tasha?
Oh, hey, Dan. Well, I hope I can follow up on that introduction. Thank you. So VAPDA is the Association of Vermont's 11 regional planning commissions. As many of you know, we don't have county government in Vermont other than the courts. So in the absence of county government, we are involved in almost every policy area in local communities, whether it's land use, transportation, emergency management, and for many small rural communities, we really serve, our planners and staff serve as the staff of the small communities because they don't have the capacity, they don't have planners on staff, economic development folks, and so we're really close to the municipalities. And at VAPDA, we're really excited about this green justice zones idea, and we're really looking forward to hearing about how this has been implemented in other areas and how we can kind of adapt and embrace these concepts for implementation in Vermont. And I think that's what I have to say, but I'm so pleased that there's so many people with us tonight.
Thanks, Tasha. Yeah, it's really great to see this many people out on a pretty warm, nice Wednesday night in Vermont. So really appreciate all of your attendance. I want us to jump right in and respect the time that folks are giving us this evening. And so I'm hoping we can start to learn about green justice zones. And so I'd like to introduce Josh Kesten, the Policy Director for Renew New England, to educate us on the policy and process of green justice zones. Josh.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? I've been having some audio issues today, so I just want to make sure we're good. Cool. Please let me know if that stops being the case. So yeah, so my name's Josh Kesten. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm calling in from my home state of Rhode Island. And so right now I'm actually on unceded Narragansett land. And yeah, so really excited to be here today. I genuinely believe that the Green Justice Zone model is, well, first of all, one of, I think, the most promising and hopeful things I've ever seen. And relatedly, I think it could really be one of the keys to addressing all of these overlapping crises that are just consuming the world right now. And actually, before I dive into the specifics, I'll just say that although I helped draft the legislation and I love the Green Justice Zone model, I did not come up with the idea. Monica Huertas, who's on this call and is going to talk after me, was the one who thought of the idea and developed it in her community. And not just that, you know, she has really been leading the charge in green justice zones for Rhode Island. And honestly, there would be no such thing as even the idea of green justice zones if it weren't for her and, you know, everything she's done for the movement. So all that to say that I can talk about green justice zones from the legislative angle, but, you know, the core of the idea and the development process, I'll leave to Monica to explain herself. Basically, just to dive right into it, Monica and I both live in Rhode Island, and I'm not sure how aware people in other states are about this specifically, but the shipping port in our capital city, Providence, is just an unbelievably severe environmental disaster area. It's pretty mind-bending how heavily polluted the area is. So we're talking like leaky fossil fuel storage sites, scrap metal yards, toxic chemical production, hazardous waste storage, like the list just goes on. And it's a huge part of the reason why kids who grow up near the port have some of the highest asthma rates in the entire country. And it's also a huge part of why one of the main reasons that kids in Providence miss school is because of super severe asthma attacks. And on top of that, you know, with climate change making storms stronger and more frequent, that whole area near the port is just an even bigger disaster waiting to happen. So I hope some of us remember what happened a few years ago when Hurricane Harvey just smashed into Houston and all of the petrochemical facilities that got flooded and you know, started sending toxic chemicals pouring throughout the city, just poisoning people left and right, soaking into the soil, and you know, causing all of those unspeakably severe public health problems for just tens of thousands of people. And the sad fact is that that is the track that Providence is on right now, unless we clean up all of those hazardous pollutants immediately. So essentially, the Port of Providence is another classic example of environmental racism, and that actually is why this policy idea is relevant for rights and democracy as well, because of course it's not just in Rhode Island where we have sacrifice zones, and even the idea of the green even though the idea of the green justice zone emerged from Providence specifically, I think it's actually a very promising idea for addressing environmental racism really anywhere. So with that said, I'll just get into the specifics. So the idea is pretty simple. It boils down to two things. Creating a green justice zone is really about two things. And the first thing means shutting down all of the corporate polluters inside the zone. And so in Providence, it's essentially the Port of Providence. And so here that means oil storage facilities, like I said, scrap metal yards, chemical storage sites. But for another green justice zone in another part of the world, it could mean, you know, LNG pipelines or oil refineries, or you know, a factory that's spewing chemicals into the water, or hazardous waste storage sites, and so on. So that's the first thing, shutting down all of the corporate polluters immediately. And then the second piece means providing funding for a bunch of environmental remediation projects for the residents of the Green Justice Zone. And I think the really cool thing about the way that this works in the legislation is that the local community itself gets to decide how they want to spend money through a participatory budgeting process to select which environmental remediation projects are most urgent and attractive. And so the legislation that we drafted here in Rhode Island says that they have to convene the state has to convene a series of community meetings where people, zone residents within the Green Justice Zone, discuss the different environmental remediation projects that they could choose, like, for example, replacing lead pipes or installing air filtration systems in homes, or remediating lead paint, or building solar panels, or cultivating local green spaces. And so the state pays for all of these meetings. So the state pays for the venue, for the food and drink, for translators, super important, for transportation to and from the venue, and for childcare. All that stuff the state pays for. And the role of the community is just to discuss the different environmental remediation options. And then after all of those meetings have taken place, the Secretary of State would hold a ballot referendum where Green Justice Zone residents can pick the environmental remediation projects that are most important for them. And of course, the referendum would only be open to zone residents. So we're really giving people very deep local control over how their neighborhood is governed with this idea. And the last thing that's important to note about these environmental remediation projects is that all of those jobs to do the work of, replacing lead pipes or cultivating local green spaces or any of those other options, all of those jobs would first go to community members in order to help remedy, some of the harm that's been caused by decades, centuries in many places of pollution. Okay, so speaking of jobs, we have to talk about the really important question of what happens to the people who currently work at who currently have jobs with the corporate polluters within the Green Justice Zone, who are going to have to shut down. Like, what happens to the workers of a local LNG plant, or like a scrap metal yard, or a hazardous waste storage site? And this is obviously, I don't need to tell anyone here this probably, but like obviously a critically important issue, since first of all, like, these workers are often being exploited by this very same companies that are poisoning the zone residents. So we need to make sure that they're treated with dignity. And also, second of all, we know that one of the main ways that giant polluters wage their propaganda war on people is by making bad faith, disingenuous arguments about frontline worker jobs and how transitioning away from fossil fuels will hurt those workers. So, we thought really carefully about that when we were putting together the legislation. And we assembled what I think, I'm pretty confident is the most generous just transition package that's been proposed anywhere in the country. And we looked at literally every state in the country. And so basically the legislation says that the Green Justice Zone legislation in Rhode Island that we introduced says that the Department of Labor and Training is instructed to work with all of the workers who currently have jobs at these polluting industries that are being shut down in the zone, and to help them find jobs. And that essentially involves three specific things. So the first thing is, first of all, the Department of Labor and Training would work one-on-one with every single worker, and together they'll figure out what that worker's interests are and what kind of job they might like to have next. And then the agency will give them free job training and free apprenticeships for the new career that they've picked out. So for example, like, let's say you wanted to become like a carpenter or an electrician, you have to go through an apprenticeship for that, especially if you want to be like eligible for union membership. And so the state under this plan will pay for you to enroll in whatever classes or apprenticeship programs you think you need in order to learn that new profession. And then finally, the third and last step here is that, and this is the really crucial piece, I think, is that each worker is awarded what we're calling a just transition salary, which basically will continue their current salary and their current benefits at the current levels for the next 2 years straight. So the idea here is basically that we're paying them for the time that they need to complete the job training program. Because of course, as we all know, like, most people can't afford to just take a few years off to put themselves through school. So not only are all the job training and apprenticeship programs completely free for the individual workers, but the workers are actually getting paid to participate in those programs, and they're keeping all their current benefits during that time as well. One last really cool thing about this is that we wrote into the legislation that the current workers at these corporate polluters that are getting shut down are going to be the second in line for any jobs that are created to carry out any of the environmental remediation projects that I just talked about. So remember how like zone residents are first in line for these jobs, and then think of it as like the displaced workers are second in line for any of those jobs, replacing lead pipes, cultivating local green spaces, etc. Oh, and one last thing that's worth mentioning is how well this program would coincide with and synchronize with other ambitious environmental justice policies, almost all of which are going to require huge numbers of well-paid unionized workers to properly pull off. So I'll just give a couple examples. So like, first of all, we all know that we have like just a massive housing shortage, and we need to build millions of green and affordable and low income homes. Another example is that we need to lay millions of miles of tracks of railroad to create like an actual regional mass transit system, so people aren't locked into driving private cars if they want to get anywhere. We also need to install millions of rooftop solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. And the point is that all of these tasks require so much work to actually pull off. And so having these programs up and running, programs to pay people good wages with good benefits and safe working conditions, having these programs up and running will help a lot in smoothing the road for displaced workers through the Green Justice Zone program, because there will be tons, like tens of millions of desirable jobs to be retrained for. So that gets rid of, by the way, the central obstacle that seems to be bogging down debates about just transition stuff, where people are like, well, retraining is fine, but where are the jobs? Well, what the Green Justice Zone program is saying is that actually, if we took these environmental justice projects seriously, we'd have a surplus of jobs and a shortage of workers. Okay, so that's the Just Transition program. I guess I'll just say one more thing about the legislation quickly before passing it on to Monica. I think the Green Justice Zone model really synthesizes the best and the most radical ideas that have been sort of percolating and bubbling up around the world about how to deal with the fact that the planet right now is full of areas, usually in BIPOC communities and working class communities, that are just horribly overburdened by pollution. And I think what's so cool about this model is that it gives such a clear answer to that problem. And the answer is that those are the geographic areas that have always, for our entire history, been last to get resources, last to get environmental protection, last to get economic security. And what's so cool and compelling, at least to my mind, about the Green Justice Zone model is that it totally flips that on its head and says, no, actually, these communities need to be first in line. So for example, we know we want to replace all the millions, tens of millions of lead pipes that are strewn throughout the world, so everyone has clean drinking water. And the Green Justice Zone model says, let's start with the residents of these Green Justice Zones. Like, we want everyone to have green spaces. Great. Green Justice Zone residents should be first in line for that, not last. So it's flipping the usual way that it works on its head. So in that sense, the way I like to think about Green Justice Zones is kind of like, they're sort of like concrete, condensed, like patches of the future that we're fighting for. So like the future we want is one where nobody drinks water from lead pipes and nobody breathes poisonous air, and everyone has collective control over their community. And the Green Justice Zone is kind of like, it's kind of like modeling and demonstrating for us what that future will actually concretely look like in reality, starting with the communities that have been left last all the time and have been most intensely oppressed and exploited. So yeah, so that's how the legislation would work. So now I will stop talking and pass it over to Monica, who, again, just for anyone who didn't catch it when I said it the first time, is really the person who came up with this idea and who's done the really hard organizing to push it forward. So yeah, that's all I got.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Josh. Thank you for laying it all out. So I know a lot of folks are wondering, Monica Huertas, I use she, her pronouns. Thank you, Josh. You did an amazing job laying it all out for us. I actually, you know, I really have been like championing this, and yes, I kind of like been spearheading it and fighting for it and like all that the good stuff. But the fact of the matter is that I just took pieces of great things that I saw happening all over the country, from California to Minnesota, to New York to Puerto Rico, and I kind of dreamed it all up and said, oh my God, what if we did this here? Like, what if we did this all in one city? Like, how would that work if we just dreamed big and said, hey, these are the zones that, these are the areas that get the most pollution, and put it all in one spot, right? So anyways, I'm gonna just go back a little bit. So I've been organizing here in Providence for about 7 years now. I'm the mother of 4 children, and really my organizing around environmental justice happened when I, you know, had the American dream, and then I bought my house, and then there was like, oh, you can't have a garden back there because you have to remediate the soil. I'm going to remediate the who? Yeah, I didn't understand, right? Because some of these things. And so I started learning. And then at the same time that happened, one of my children was hospitalized 7 times due to the asthma exacerbation that we face, because we are in fact have the worst asthma. I think it's the second in the entire country. And so, and mind you, we're tiny. I don't know if folks are familiar with Rhode Island or with Providence, but we're tiny. We're the smallest state. And so it's like, are you for real? And so anyway, we've been organizing. And so you might ask, like, how did they come up with this, right? It's something that you really can't, it's good because it's easily like copied, what's the word? You can copy it, right? In different places. But in order for you to copy it, you can't just copy and paste it, because you really have to have a deep understanding and have a deep development and community involvement with these. So we started here in Providence, where we created the climate justice plan. And so for folks who are not familiar, I think I'm gonna be able to drop it in the chat. I think I have pulled it up. It's called the Providence Climate Justice Plan. And it's really a plan where we got communities, people from all over the city, the most impacted, Black and brown folks, poor folks, and I'm gonna drop it in the chat. And we got them all together and we said, hey, what, you know, the city wanted to create this program where they invited a bunch of people of color to talk about our environment. And we was like, hold on a minute, you know, because it's not just about environment, right? It's like, how do you heat your home in the winter? How do you stay cool in the summer? Where is the school? What is, let's talk about school to prison pipeline. Let's talk about what are, you know, how do you feed your kids? Like, what are the services that you need, right? And so we started talking about that, and then we gradually started talking about environmental injustice, because the fact of the matter is it's embedded in everything, right? So you can find, whether it's really good people trying to ban plastic bags, right? Because they're like, oh yeah, ban plastic bags, and they don't know that actually that affects poor people the most, because the poor people are paying millions and billions of dollars a year in like to buy plastic bags, right? And so so we got a group together of people who cared about the environment, but we also got people who are like parents and artists and teachers and, you know, people who do different types of things and work and works in the city. And so we got together and started developing a plan. And so we came up with the climate justice plan. And the climate justice plan, you can look at it, it's in the chat, and it's like 90 points of different things that the city can do. First of all, we actually, you know, we asked the city to acknowledge that that the city was built on stolen land, that it was built and it became an industrial and beautiful city off of the labor of enslaved folks, and then later on of migrant workers, of refugees, of or immigrants, right? And so then we said, okay, and these are the steps that you need to take as a city in order to mitigate that. And so we wrote 90 points, and you can see it in the climate justice plan, 90 points, where it says, okay, this has to, we need this, this, and that. And Department of Environmental Management, you can do this and that. And the city, you can do this. And the Transportation Authority can do this, right? And so we laid it all out for them. So having that background and having those community meetings, we said, why don't we create a system where, because we all know that these these type of neighborhoods are, right, it's like the unwanted pollutants and the unwanted people are all together, right? Because they just throw us there, like, oh, let's make a poor neighborhood here, and you know, put some coal here or some tar there, and some you know, LNG or LPG there, and then a couple Black and brown folks or poor folks can live in there. And so we said, how about we completely change that, like Josh was saying, turn it around, and because the fact is also when people get money to do some of this remediation, said like the pipe for the lead pipes, right? Then the community that has a little bit more money will get that money, right? It's not even funneled in a good way, the money that we would get to fix some of the things. And so we said, let's change that and let's make an area where that's changed. And so how we got to the areas where we looked at some maps from EPA, we looked at maps from DEM, Department of Environmental Management, and we looked at some asthma hotspots maps that were given to us by the health department. And so we put all those maps together and we said, which ones are the communities that are being affected the most, which one are the asthma hotspots? And so, and we knew what it was, right? Because we're in the community, but we sort of had to kind of prove it to everybody else. Like, look, this is where it's happening, right? The data, for those who are like data kind of inclined. And so we got the maps together. And so we said, okay, South Providence, where the port is, and then there's another area what's called Olneyville and Manton Avenue. And they have a lot of those old buildings that we have all over New England, where it's like you know, like nice brick buildings that were once factories, and then now like all these hipsters are like trying to convert into stuff, you know. And so they have those, and then they have like rivers and things like that going through them. And so they've been experiencing, like when it rains, they have the once in every 100-year floods, they'll have them every 5 years now, right? And so those are the communities that we identified. And so we said, so let's have these zones, and in these zones, we'll do all these beautiful things, you know, all the things that Josh outlined. And so we'll have, and not only that, but then let's talk to the hospitals that are around here, right? Let's have doulas. And then we started dreaming big and big, and we're like, okay, so then this zone, there cannot be any charter schools, right? That was like it can't be no charter schools in that zone. And in that zone, you know, everything, it's going to be bike, and there's going to be a grocery store that's healthy and good food, right? And so the WIC office is going to be more accessible. And then, you know, so then we started dreaming big, and then it's like, it's going to be less police presence, right? So it's going to be our little own suburb right in the middle of the city, our little own clean, beautiful kind of oasis, if you will, in the middle of Providence. And so again, we got there by doing intense community development, intense community gatherings, and, you know, we provided food for people. Everything that we outlined in the policy, we did it ourselves. So that's why we know you can do it again, you can copy it. And you know, we provided transportation, we provided health, childcare at the meetings, and food and dinner for folks, training and education. And so that's why we know we can do it at a bigger scale. How do we do it at a bigger scale and model this? So then when we do have a flood, or we have an earthquake, or we have any disaster, you know, the lake goes off, or, you know, something. And so we have these hubs, resiliency hubs, where we can go to that are in the zone. So anyways, it's just like a conglomerate of like good and better things. And so right now, the policy was actually, we had it in the House and the Senate here, and the legislator. And of course, there wasn't as attacked as we would like it. You know, people didn't really pick it up, and we were like, this is great. Of course, it's our thing, it's our baby. So we're like, oh my God, we're like, why are you not, you know, trying to Oh, sorry, I'm not keeping track of the chat, so I'll try to get it in a minute.
We're gonna do, just so you know, Monica, we're gonna do questions and answers right after you're done, so don't worry.
Okay,
about it.
sounds good. Sounds good. And so anyways, and so now we're fighting so that we can actually get this passed. And so we're doing it on a couple different fronts. So we're doing it at the city level front, talking to city councils, meeting with them, having them endorse it. And even before they even get elected, having this be like a promise that they do, like we promise to do this and that and pass it, blah, blah, blah. And then also at the state level where it's like having the legislator, people are scared to do this. And so we're saying, we don't want to do it at the whole scale. We know that these are things that we got to change all of it immediately. It's impossible financially, right? And impossible for like the amount of workforce that you need. But if you would do this, just this zone so that you can see how good and great it is, then, at least it's a starting point, right? And so anyways, we're working really hard on doing that. Last year, it didn't pass, so it's introduced again. We brought over 400 and something people each time that it was seen in the House and the Senate. And we introduced it with a package of like 3 different bills, which was like the housing portion and the jobs portion that Josh spoke about. So we introduced that and introduced it into 3 different bills. So it was like the clean air, housing, and the jobs. And so, some people love the housing part and hate the job part, or vice versa. And so anyways, we're like, we don't want to break it up. This is a full package. This is as good as they're going to get. We're sick of, the elected officials trying to chop something up and just pass one sentence and say, oh, you can't discriminate because you're on Section 8. And then that's it. But why and who and what are the parameters around there? Who's going to make sure that people are not getting discriminated on, and et cetera, right? And so it's a really rambunctious package, as you can see, but it's our baby. And I really think, again, the joys of it is that you can do it anywhere, as long as you have a lot of community input and a lot of community insight and a lot of community buy-in, because I think that's part of the reason why a lot of us, people of color, poor people, we don't organize, and none of us, we do organize tremendously, but the environmental kind of always gets the back burner. But I think it's because we haven't been asked to be at the table to create these things. People always get our opinion afterwards. People are like, oh, we did a survey. Can you answer the survey? We're like, no, we want to be there when you guys come up with the questions, right? What are the questions to ask? Or even do you ask questions, right? And so I think if you got that good buy-in in the beginning, that is very easy to continue forward and spread it out. And then and I think that's where my mission has become, to spread it all out here in Rhode Island, but then also right New England, and see who grabs it and who does it. And whoever does it, I'll move over there. I'll move over there. Hopefully I can get a little corner somewhere and do this. So yeah, I'm gonna take, I guess we could take questions if you have any, but I guess we can go in order.
Thank you, Monica. You promising to move to wherever we do this it might be incentive enough to just bring you up to Vermont. We have 2 questions in the chat, so I'll just start with those, and either Josh or Monica, either one, please answer as you feel comfortable. And if other folks want to ask, they can put it in the chat or raise their virtual hand. Scott asks, has there been any consideration of giving workers an option to pool their 2 years of training income and apply it to a business startup? I think there's a model from Ohio I've seen that encourages co-op creation. If 10 or more displaced workers can agree to form a business, the state then gives the new co-op an advance on their remittance payments to help cover the startup costs of the new business.
That's a great, Josh, let's add that in. I mean, whatever it is, and that's what it is. It's whatever floats your boat, I guess. If that's what the community wants, and that's what, community is into, then you can certainly do it. We don't have it in ours, so go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. We don't have it in ours. I think that's an awesome idea. Also, the other thing I was going to say is this is why I always hate, I just hate talking before Monica, because everyone always forgets what I say, and they're always like, oh, it's so boring. And then it's just she always just totally outshines me. But anyway, that's, but yeah, that's not in ours. It's it's a really, really good idea. And I actually just jotted a note down when I saw you type that in the chat, because I think it's a really, really smart move. And I think worker cooperatives is exactly what we're shooting for here, with local control over communities. It's local democracy is really the essence of it.
Yes, little democracy, right? And thanks, Josh. That's a you problem, Josh. You better fix that.
Great. So second question, Callie Fishburne asked, I know that the Rhode Island Health Department established a health equity zone program a few years ago, and this is model that Vermont Health Department is planning to adapt. Have there been any discussions or plans for collaboration with some of the health equity zones in the Providence area?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, and the issue with that is that there's no issue. I think there's great programs. I think we kind of do whatever we can and whatever sticks and whatever works. But that's the challenge, right? That it's like, oh, health equity zone. Yes, let's do that. And everything was written down and then it was brought to the community, right? And so it does have some community input and some community buy-in and stuff like that, but it's not really something that is so it has its issues, and it's led by people who are not necessarily from our community and things like that. And so that's all I can say about that, really. And yeah, you can't have that much buy-in from a community that was not there from the beginning.
I got the Oreo one.
Okay.
All right. So we had two different questions around the funding. How is this initiative funded? Is this a tax on businesses or a specific fund they pay into? And what are the thresholds to shut down businesses, and who makes that decision?
Can I take that one, Monica? Is that okay? Yeah. Super good question. So I'll give one overall answer and then some specifics. So the overall answer is like, how is this funded? It's by taxing the rich. Shocker. But I'll some specifics that are really important for this, for Rhode Island in particular, and for another. Yeah, I see that in the chat, Liz. It's good to see you again, by the way. I think the last time I saw Liz was on the panel for the job guarantee, so it's like right in line with that. But anyway, the main thing that I want to point out here, which is relevant both for Rhode Island and for Vermont and New Hampshire, is that the amount of money that you can get from taxing the rich is actually enormous when you calculate it, but also the amount of money that you can get when you tax people, when you increase property taxes for people's second homes is just unreal, especially in New England, because we have so much coastal property. Like, so many extremely rich people buy coastal property throughout New England, and they have enough money to like pay for this for sure. And so just to like, I haven't done the numbers in Vermont specifically, but in Rhode Island, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that we could get by raising the property tax rate on second home owners by like 3%. Like, we could fund this program like 7 or 8 times over with that money. So all that's to say, like, I totally appreciate the question about like how we pay for it. It's not out of workers' pockets. It's entirely out of like CEOs' pockets and the super rich pockets.
Thanks, Josh. A specific question, I think, to something you said earlier, Josh. What's the logic that displaced workers will be second in line for new jobs rather than first?
Yeah, I think this one's tough. I really want to resist the idea that we're pitting frontline communities against workers. I think that's part of the problem, is that we're stuck in that mindset. I think the most important thing that we're developing, the most important piece of this design, is that the marginalized communities and the frontline communities are put before everyone else. I'm like much less concerned with the like first, second place thing, and much more concerned with ensuring that the people who've borne the brunt of pollution and borne the brunt of economic exploitation are in a group together against the 1%. And so I don't want people to read too much into the first in line, second in line thing. Like, I think it's very important for people who live in the zone to be given priority access to this stuff. I just kind of resist almost like the logic of the question, which is that like marginalized communities need to be pitted against each other in this way. But I'm curious what
Thank you.
Monica, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's exactly right. And it's again, like we have been disenfranchised for so long, and that's why. But also it's like, you know, my husband is a union carpenter. And so they are there when I talk shit about this plant that I want to shut down. They're literally there saying, oh no, we don't want it, right? And so, and I always say I'm a proud union wife. You know, my husband is a proud union carpenter. And we need to build good things that last, you know, good quality things for all of us. And so I guess, and who's to say that, saying that, right? Who's to say that first and second would they mesh, right? Because a lot of the workers that live there might live here as well, right? Our frontline community members. And so, which would make sense, right? Because we're not talking about high paying people with a lot of money that they live in Connecticut. We're talking about, you know, people who are scrapping the metal, you know what I'm saying? The people who are truck driving, those people live here too, you know? And so, yeah, I thank you, Josh, for saying that.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Josh. I think we might have time for one more question, and I know that means we won't get to everyone's questions, but I do want to leave time for the breakout groups, some envisioning and some conversation. So I will just ask, would the participatory budgeting include revenue as well as spending then? And Matt Burke, I don't know if you have any more to say on that before they answer.
Thanks. Only that I see most of the participatory budgeting, the way it's put into practice is usually on the spending, and that's a great start. And it's always complicated to get true participation in participatory budgeting. So just wondering how that might work, and that you get really a full picture from the community and from the options, the full options.
Do you want to take a first crack at this one, Monica, or do you want me to go? Cool. So I think that's a really good question. I think one thing I would say about I think ideally the participatory budgeting covers both the revenue and the expenditures, but I do think there's an important complication to mention here, which is that the way, and this is like maybe like a little too technical in terms of like how we drafted the legislation here, but like the way it works is the state is funneling money to the zone, and the zone residents themselves are getting to spend the money. So it's not that the zone residents are like deciding how the state raises the money. That's the state's problem. Like the state has to figure out how, and when we calculated it, it's like $50 million for the whole program, like front to back. And like, and by the way, that's like, I know that sounds like a lot, but like in terms of like a state's GDP and like the amount of money that we could get from taxing second homes and the income of the 1%, like that's nothing. And so so the participatory budgeting process is primarily the way it's drafted right now about spending the money that the state gives to the zone. And that goes back to what I was trying to say about like flipping it on its head. Like the zone residents don't need to figure out like which tax to implement to like across the state to raise money for this. That's the burden of the state legislators who've been funneling pollution into this area for so long and now need to make up for, can I swear? Maybe I won't swear. To make up for all the stuff they've done.
Thanks, Josh. I don't have anything to add, but I really want to add. I know you got to go, Dan, but I just really want this. It's important to in the breakout room so they can have all the information. And so it was really hard because we did it during COVID, but you know, it was in the middle of COVID and all these deaths and things going around us, especially with us in low income and people of color in homes. But we were not even close. You know, we weren't close. Like they heard it. They had to hear us. We kept them up till 11, 12 o'clock at night or whatever, how long it was, right? And we was like we were like the thorn in their side, and we'll continue to do that. One of the things that worked, and this is So anyways, we did a lot of training, education, and educating folks in the community about what it was and what we were doing. If they didn't have an idea, most people had. And then Zoom helped a little bit because, people couldn't actually go from their homes, and then they have to bring their kids out and wait there and have their husband text you like, you still there, And so we had that advantage. And so they like hated Zoom and were like, no, we want to go full person, even though they're like, the state house wasn't even open. They're like, no, we want to go full person and full, right, and present, because they didn't want to provide those opportunities for us to testify via Zoom and everything like that. And I'm like, yeah, when you bring hundreds of people to testify and are there for hours and hours, and they're gonna get pissed. And so actually, they got so much shit for it, because it was really just stirred everything that these people think about, that some of the legislators that promised to be champions for backed up. And they were even in one of our co-ops, where like a political co-op that we do on the side to like put good candidates, they even like turned their back on us. And so this is how political and how crazy this thing was. And so anyway, so you're gonna, there's gonna be backlash, but I think it's when you're on the right side of history, then you're not gonna back down. When this is gonna benefit so many people, and not just us, right? Not just in the zone, but everybody, a lot of people. And so, anyways, that's what I can say, and that's all.
Well, thank you so much, Monica and Josh. Really appreciate the information. I said before that Rights and Democracy is part of Vermont Renews and Renew New England. Josh works with Renew New England. Monica does work down there. So we have a lot of access to these folks and a lot more great folks across the region. So this hopefully won't be the last time you'll be hearing from Renew New England and hearing information about this important initiative. I want to move us on to breakout rooms so we can have some conversations, discussions, and process a little bit about what folks have just heard. It's really a first step to start to think about what green justice zones could look like in our communities, and also figure out if there's specific questions that you all have about how could this actually happen in my community, and what are the things I don't know or I want to know before I start working on that. So we are going to have facilitators in all the breakout rooms. I want to thank Vermont Natural Resources Council, AFL-CIO, and 350 Vermont for having some volunteers help us with facilitating the breakout rooms. I'm going to throw the breakout room questions in the chat right now, so they're available for everyone, and your facilitator should have them as well. And we'll be taking good notes. I will say to facilitators, go where the conversation goes. We're gonna spend 20 minutes in the room. If you can't get to all the questions, it's totally fine. Do whatever the group moves, and also try to have someone be ready to give a brief synopsis of some of the conversation that happens when we all get back together. So unless there's any real concerns, I'm gonna move us all into breakout rooms. All right, see you all in 20 minutes. And if you're in room 6, I will be there to facilitate in just a minute. All right, just wait another minute as everybody comes back together. Want to save some time for some report back and make sure that we can hear what happened in some of the other groups. Luckily, hopefully your facilitators were all taking good notes, and so we'll be able to look at all of those and get a much fuller sense, but would love to hear some report backs. Is there a group that wants to go first? If not, I'll just call out groups in the order that you happen to be randomly numbered.
Melanie Riddle, group 8. I feel like that's good to end, so I'll go first.
Go, let's do it.
So we talked a lot about the issues, needs, and infrastructure that we were seeing in our communities. And the big theme was transportation, specifically looking at affordability or sidewalks, accessibility, crosswalk safety, basically transportation issues. And also access for community space within either a town or a community, so that people could gather and actually get to know each other, so that they could work on issues or talk about them or address them. Not every single small town has a really good space to do that. And then water and wastewater infrastructure, so that we could kind of, address some of the housing needs. And then that was followed up with affordable housing and, basically from a broad range of, can we make sure that there is affordable housing for all sorts of jobs within Vermont? Basically, lack of resources in small towns came up. And then we briefly towards the end talked about kind of the community members, what are we looking at, what would we like to see, and basically kind of more people at the table, and how do we include more people within the community. And often in small towns there's a lot of people taking on multiple roles, and so how can we make that easier, or how to not necessarily incentivize, but how do we make that easier for more people to participate, so it's less volunteers doing everything. Thanks.
Thank you, Melanie, for a great start to the report back. Is there another volunteer? Brian?
Yes, thanks.
What group number were you, just so I can keep track?
I have no idea. Matt, are you somewhere to bail me
I think
out?
we
on
were
that?
5.
Thanks.
Thank you. I didn't know that was part of the 3 questions. That actually makes 4 questions, Dan. So we talked about the sort of general rural nature of the bulk of our different areas in southern Vermont and central Vermont, and how the some of the more populated areas are located in flood-prone locations, a general lack of water and wastewater infrastructure, and how that distorts the market and presents all number of different affordability issues. We also talked about climate and COVID migration, as another factor in the distortion of the land market. In terms of community involvement, we all acknowledge that it's, as Melanie mentioned as well, that it's tough to get participation out of what appears to be a small core group, but that, one of the lessons that we learned during COVID is that it's possible to have these digital meetings and to open up the possibility of greater participation. It just takes a little bit of effort and promotion, but that's something that's certainly possible and could be a way to bring more people to the table. And then had another idea about just looking for local champions, like a business owner or some organization to sponsor or organize a method for funding people to participate. So people that would have to take a day off work, instead of going without pay, might be able to get pay and participate in the public process.
Thanks so much, Brian. Liz?
Great, thank you. Happy to represent Group 2, which was filled with great ideas. A lot of them have been already mentioned. We did bring up in terms of infrastructure, public transportation in the broadest sense of the term, including bike paths and ways to walk and access areas that are not just for cars. And we talked a lot about how there is a great need to improve our housing stock, and also, relocate potentially or have safer residences for those who are concentrated in flood zones. And our housing stock is notoriously old and needs a lot of weatherization and to be brought up to code. And we also recognize that there are quite a number of small mobile home parks too that need to be part of this equation. And we also discussed how there's a lot of toxic materials in these homes too, in terms of lead paint. And in terms of how to actually get community members involved, we talked about, various ways to tap into already organized communities and create new organized communities. So, actually going out there and doing the outreach, having things like potlucks, which I think is very Vermont-esque and true, that brings people together. Churches and schools are gathering places in our communities. We can also tie that in with, ways for people who have a harder time, maybe getting out into the community through questions and surveys. And we can also build partnerships with communities that we want to involve, communities that are providing community health services, and prevention specialists were mentioned, for instance, or, undocumented workers were mentioned a number of times because they deal with a lot of agricultural pollution. We could reach out to organizations like Migrant Justice to include their voices. And just as the room was closing, there's mention of community builds, which are a way to bring people together on an actual work project and, you know, learn as they're doing. And apparently there's some really exciting examples of that in Bellows Falls. And and we also mentioned that it is somehow very hard in Vermont to tax the rich, though we absolutely need to do that. I guess there's a lot of second homeowners here, but that's pretty much a good summary, and I'll let anyone from my group chime in if I missed anything. Thank you.
Hearing none from group 2, Scott, you raised your hand. Are you reporting back for a group?
Yeah, group 7.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say we talked a bit about the culture shift within our own organizations that you know, would need to happen to go to the community sort of with a humility and first ask them how they want to do things and how they want the process to run, instead of just going with a sort of prescriptive mandate from the state or from, you know, some grant funding. And then also about how the conversations may not necessarily start off with the things that you know, are the sort of environmental issues with environmental justice. So there may be some triage that needs to happen first, or getting people out of the floodplain before worrying about what, you know, is in the river water. You know, and the entire process might take longer than we sort of thought. But overall, those conversations, while they might not meet the classical definition of efficient, they may be in the long term more effective towards actually creating, you know, substantive change in the communities. And that there's sort of a core system change that we would need to address related to sort of the power dynamic in the funding to allow that to happen. So the milestones are, you know, meet the right steps and the goals for that type of process.
Great, Scott. Thank you so much. Other volunteers?
I can do group 3.
Great, thanks, Chris.
So, well, we really, I guess, dealt most with the first question. But one is kind of addressing the perception Vermonters have about themselves and the state, and what does green justice look like in Vermont, just recognizing even the issue and the challenges there. And access to the energy transition writ large, addressing housing as part of the climate change is an issue. The tension we have in many communities throughout Vermont between second homeowners / the relatively wealthy being a major component of the economy, and economic equity. I noted, because I'm serving on the Climate Council, greenhouse gas reduction is prioritized a good bit above adaptation and resilience. And I'll just say, because I made that comment, from my perspective, that creates a fundamental equity and justice issue in our work around this, because while we absolutely have to reduce the greenhouse gases, we shouldn't be reducing the priority of adaptation resilience, especially the impact on the frontline communities who are already having to struggle with the status quo. And then identifying communities, mapping them, encouraging people to reach out for help and take advantage of programs, framing who is burdened and how to effectively deliver assistance at a meaningful scale in a non-stigmatizing way. And then we got to the question of how to have people, you know, better engage in things like in our work of planning. And part of it actually gets to the structure of governance in the state and how diffuse our planning and budgeting processes and all are. On the one hand, you could say, well, maybe the smaller scale is more beneficial, but then it also could create some unintended inequities as far as access to the local decision making. But then also some very practical recommendations, like the use of stipends to support engagement of people and things, providing services during meetings, things like childcare, I'll add adult daycare, and
yeah, I think that we had a good discussion. Feel free, anybody else on our group, to add to this.
All right, thank you, Chris, and your group. Seth Jensen, are you reporting for one of the groups?
Yep. So reporting for group one, there were two of us and we both worked for regional planning commissions. So it was perhaps a narrow perspective, but you know, on the question of engagement and engagement tools, you know, we kind of talked about specifically from the regional planning commission role of providing support to municipalities, meaning that usually means support via the select board or trustees, and support on, you know, municipal budgeting and municipal issues. And I think we both acknowledge that these issues are broader than that, that there's community development issues and other things that are important when you're having a conversation about environmental justice. In our role, most of the time, that would be, you know, only it would mostly be community development projects so there's a need to kind of bring in broader voices sometimes to address some of the issues that we're talking about. We also talked somewhat about some unique Vermont challenges, and with you know, our larger villages and downtowns largely in the floodplain and our smaller ones without wastewater. We kind of have two environmental justice problems creating a fairly major challenge. And one item that I mentioned related to that is there's a workforce issue of some of the tools for flood mitigation and flood proofing, as well as some of the newer technologies that can help with rural wastewater. There's a lack of workforce upskilling, but also an opportunity for potentially for some of the folks who work in general contracting or independent contractors to fill that void if there were more support for upskilling for some of those targeted specialties.
Thank you, Seth. I'll report briefly for group 6. We had a great spirited conversation. When it comes to question 1 and the issues, there was some talk about historic brownfields and pollution sites in a community, a lot of synergy around transportation, and a lot of conversation about housing, and housing has to be part of this conversation. We talked a little bit about the process overall and how we do things now and how the process has to change, and changing business as usual is hard and we have to work through the discomfort of that. And then there were also a lot of questions, I think, thinking about how we make green justice zones a reality, around the funding, the piece, also whether businesses would be interested in being in these green justice zones or whether they would just locate just outside of them. How does this policy work with the potential new environmental justice legislation, S148? How does it work with EPA's Justice 40 tool and some of their other screening tools that they already have? And like how, just kind of the nuts and bolts of how it would work. So quite a few questions in our group. And I think the last group is Greta. Did you have your hand up for a second to present for the last group?
I did, but you said a lot of what I was going to say, Dan. So I think this is going to be largely familiar to what folks have already said at this point, but we had a great conversation, and housing, transportation, and just engaging folks in general was a lot of the basis of our conversation. We also talked about the Justice 40 initiative and how we can do this work without reinventing the wheel. But ultimately, I think a lot of what it comes down to is compensating folks for their time and what would it mean for community leadership. And a lot of times it means paying people to give their input and their opinion and their lived experience. And so that was a lot of the conversation that we had as well. And we had good representation in the same way to what you were just saying, Dan, from the brownfields remediation perspective, from folks who are doing on the ground work around housing and community engagement, and just, you know, what would it look like to bring more people into the conversation? And a lot of the times it does come down to compensating them for their time and energy and their contributions. So yeah, it was a great conversation.
Thanks so much, Greta, and everyone who just reported back and everyone who really engaged in these conversations. This is just the start of a conversation. I think there's probably a lot of energy and thoughts and ideas around it, but also a lot of questions about how we can make this a reality in Vermont. So I think we're all probably sitting in that place of wanting it to be done right away, but also knowing that we need to still figure a lot of things out. So I want to make sure that everyone knows that we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to have continued opportunities. I want to offer up, if there are specific parts of the state or folks from agencies or groups that want to have further conversations about this, that we are definitely open and ready to have those conversations. My email is pretty easy for anyone who might need it, dan@radvt.org. Anyone and everyone is welcome to use it. We also have a Green Justice Zones petition. It's a very basic, like, this sounds like a good idea petition. It's a way to get you on our mailing list, so that way, as we have new events or we're, you know, having discussions, you know, sharing articles, that kind of stuff, you'd be on that. We aren't going to send you something every day or probably every week, but if you'd like to be caught up on what Rights and Democracy is doing for Green Justice Zones, that is a way to do it. I want to thank VAPDA once again for co-hosting this event. And the way that I will thank them is by not trying to say what their full name is again, because it's very difficult for me for some reason, but appreciate VAPDA being with us. Tasha Wallace for introducing VAPDA, Chris Campany for working and planning this event with us. Also want to thank again the Vermont AFL-CIO, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and 350 Vermont for helping out with volunteering for facilitators, along with Matt Burke. Thank you very much. That help was really crucial to making this successful. And with that, we are finished for the evening. I really appreciate you all staying till 7:30 and a little past, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.
Thanks for facilitating us, Dan.
Thank you.